penultimate talk of Citing Vulnerability Season 3. And in continuation of what we have attempted in this particular round, bringing together of science and humanities from Professor Prasad's talk earlier, and the forthcoming one by the glaciologist Dheeraj Ganga. We have somebody who works at the intersection of geography and the humanities, Eric Magrane, whose work is absolutely pioneering and delightful, and I think is something that more of it should be available and read. And it's a delight to be able to welcome him. I encountered his work, I think, about just a couple of years ago, and devoured quite a bit of it since then. So it's great to have you here. Great to have several people also who are regulars, but also newcomers here. The UNESCO Chair's mandate, for those of you who do not know it, is to study vulnerability across various disciplinary formations and domains, from aging to cultural vulnerability, linguistic and other vulnerabilities as well. There has been a preponderance of climate change and climate crisis, but after all, that's the language of our times. So there has been, it's a little weighted towards that. And the lectures that we've compiled as OERs on the chair's website are available for all of you to access. This series lectures will go up maybe around mid to late December. And welcome all of you to the fourth lecture in this series, and Professor Eric Magrane in particular. He's up with the earliest of the earlies at 5:30 a.m. to give us this talk. So in particular, great amount of thanks are due to you, Eric, for joining us. And over to Atul for a fulsome phrase and introduction and whatever we choose to do. Over to you, Atul.
Thank you, sir, and welcome again, Professor Eric Magrane. And if I may formally introduce you to the audience, Eric Magrane is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at New Mexico State University. He is the co-editor of The Sonoran Desert, a literary field guide published by the University of Arizona Press, which is a hybrid field guide and literary anthology that has received several awards, including a 2016 Southwest Book of the Year and a New Mexico Arizona Book Award. In his research and creative work, he is particularly interested in environmental narratives, sense of place, and contemporary artistic and literary responses to environmental change. He has been an artist in residence in 3 U.S. national parks and served as poet in residence at the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum, a bioregional zoo, botanical garden, and natural history museum. His edited book, titled Geopoetics in Practice, published in 2020 as part of Routledge's Research in Culture, Space, and Identity series. And his recent work has appeared in journals such as Bioscience, Dialogues in Human Geography, Cultural Geographies, and Literary Geographies. With this, over to you, Professor Magrane.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's an honor to speak in this UNESCO series focusing on vulnerability. As was said in that kind introduction and those opening words, I am a geographer and a poet. And much of my work has been in the geohumanities, which brings together critical and creative humanities approaches with key concerns of geography, including place, space, landscape, scale, and human-environment interactions. So my talk today is on a climate geopoetics project in which I have been writing a series of poems that take as their titles quotes on climate change. This is a means for me to bring together my interest in environmental and climate narratives with my geohumanities and geopoetic practice. Because of the nature of my talk, which includes some poems that I'm going to read, I've opted to do the presentation without a PowerPoint or slides. So if you don't see those, that's by design. It's just me here. So if you have any questions about any of the references I make or want to learn more about this project after the talk, I can share a link to an article forum in Dialogues in Human Geography about the project. And if I cough during the talk at all, my apologies in advance. I'm coming off of a bout of bronchitis, but I should be good. So I live in New Mexico in the southwestern United States. Where I live is about 45 miles or 72 kilometers from the current geopolitical border between Mexico and the United States. It is the ancestral and current homelands of the Piro Manso Tiwa tribe, who have a long-standing petition before the United States government to be federally recognized. Until the mid-1800s, where I live was part of Mexico, and before that, New Spain. Ongoing processes of colonialism, contentious immigration policies, and economic inequality intertwine with climate justice in this arid borderlands region. Some specific climate change impacts regionally where I live include drought and water stress, increasing temperatures and their effects on public health, and an extended wildfire season. So I have shared this to just briefly ground where I am speaking from. However, excuse me, the poems that I share today are not necessarily situated here where I live. When thinking about climate vulnerability, one of the tensions is, of course, paying attention to the specific challenges that specific communities, human and more than human, face, while also taking a broad Earth system view. The problematic but perhaps useful local global binary and the universal individual binary are ontologically aligned with the language of common but differentiated framings of vulnerability, responsibility, and capacity for climate adaptation and mitigation. Before going much further, I'd like to share a poem from the series, one of the first that I wrote when I began the project in 2017. Again, each poem in the series responds to a quote on climate change. So this poem that I'm going to share now responds to a quote by the writer Margaret Atwood, one which you may likely know. The quote by Atwood is, "I think calling it climate change is rather limiting. I would rather call it the everything change." So that's the title of the poem, that quote by Atwood, and here's my poem in response to that quote. The planting zones on seed packets are historical artifacts. Flowers emerge and bloom, and their pollinators are behind or ahead of schedule, like lovers just missing each other on passing trains. It's too hot in Phoenix, so the flights are grounded. The governor of California says the fire season is now all year long. In the Dakotas, colonizers open up water hoses on the protectors and send the dogs in. And the orange-faced one says something about how much he cares about Pittsburgh. Fuck Paris. So the mayors of Pittsburgh and Paris get together and say, fuck the orange-faced one. And the oceans soak it in. Corals lose their color. Water surges over Staten Island, the Rockaways, New Orleans, Bangladesh. Water seeps into and up through the porous ground of Miami. Good luck getting insurance. Sci-fi novelists write about New York City flooded, bombs go off in London, bark beetles chomp down forests, journalists write about drought as a cause of the Syrian civil war, and academics say, careful with the environmental determinism, and no more polar bear pictures on ice floes, please. They aren't helping anymore. and meet at conferences to weigh the relative values of hope and despair, coining phrases like the hope industrial complex and slow violence, while black men are murdered on YouTube, and I click a button on my MacBook Air to order a book on climate change, and it arrives at my door the next day. And researchers work with stakeholders in El Paso and Juarez on heat preparedness plans, and poets consider citizenship and plant gardens in unabashed gratitude, and island nations ponder the existential question of whether a nation can exist without land. And geochemists propose a new geologic epoch called the Anthropocene. But wait, others say, it's not all humans, it's the political economy. Stupid. It would be better to call it Capitalocene, or its patriarchy, or its industrial agriculture. So how about Manthropocene or Plantationocene? And others say that's better, but there's a lot of trouble, and we need to be thinking in terms of kinship. And other poets perform poems to their children in front of the UN Assembly on climate change, and artists haul blocks of ice from Greenland to install in a Paris plaza so passersby can see the melting world. And a musician plays the great acceleration on cello, CO2 rising until it is a fever pitch too high for human hearing. So, thinking about climate change as everything change might be both terrifying and filled with radical possibility. If the current socio-environmental moment is indeed a point where everything is changing, much of that change may be catastrophic and apocalyptic. On the other hand, everything changing opens up the possibility of rethinking how individuals, societies, and cultures relate with each other, and with the non humans and materials with whom humans share the planet. Perhaps it is a chance for reimagining and resituating much of the world in a more socially and environmentally just arrangement. In fact, climate change might be considered a crisis of the imagination, as a number of scholars, rightists, and artists have argued. So, if we take this further and consider for the moment that the relationships that have produced and that continue to produce anthropogenic climate change come from said crisis of the imagination, then addressing vulnerability as a shared and differentiated condition can also be considered a project of imagination. It is a project of if and whether we can imagine earthly, and by this I mean human and more than human relationships otherwise. The quotes, which are the titles in the poem series, represent a variety of voices. For example, one poem is titled with a quote from social theorist Donna Haraway, another by Indigenous poet and scholar Alison Adele Hedge Koch, another by geographer and climate scientist Mike Hume. The poems then respond to those quotes. Responding to these quotes in poetic form allows me a certain freedom of movement and juxtaposition within each poem. It also gives me the opportunity to offer responses in a variety of tones, from satirical to meditative to combative to despairing to hopeful to outraged. While emotional and affective responses to climate change are often understood in a dichotomy of hope versus despair, or in some imagining of a future ecotopia, utopia, or dystopia, it is my contention that a relevant climate geopoetics must endeavor to strike at all of these tones and emotional registers. While this climate geopoetics project addresses climate narratives or frames, the poems, I hope, also offer lyric or experimental spaces, by which I mean space not always beholden to story and narrative, but space that rather approaches time through image, association, and juxtaposition. As a cultural geographer and geohumanities scholar, one of my areas of research is environmental narratives. What stories do humans tell themselves about their relationship to nature and the environment? How do these stories in turn shape how humans organize themselves in relationship to each other organisms, and said environment? Nature and environment are, of course, constructs, as if we were separate from a nature or environment out there. In reality, as many cultures, particularly indigenous cultures, remind us, there is no out there. For the moment, however, take the environment as that which is around you, that which surrounds the borders of your body. For this, let's say that the skin is the border of your body. The environment then is the air you breathe, the water you drink, the food you eat, the house you live in. It is everything that is around you. How do you conceptualize that environment? Is it filled with risk and danger? Is it something to be nurtured or taken care of? Or is it something to be exploited, there for the taking? How one answers these questions point to different understandings of human environment relationships. These different understandings lead to different organizations of and relationships with and among matter. So these alternate conceptions of environment and nature lead to another poem I'd like to share, which I wrote in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. And the poem is in response to a quote by Inger Andersen, a Danish economist and the executive director of the UN Environment Program. And that quote is, "We need to go into this future armed with nature as our strongest ally." And here is my response to that quote. In my cultural geography class, I send students outside to make two lists: everything that is natural and everything that is not. Flower buds, bugs, trees, people, mountains, clouds, soil, they write on the natural side of the board when they are inside. Cell phones, buildings, cars, they write on the other. People are natural, they say, mostly, while things made by people are not. That there is an outside, that there is an inside. Discomfort with the battle metaphor, to take up with open arms. What is human nature? To be an ally of that which we are. What we know, yet have no art to say, wrote Emily Dickinson. So impotent our wisdom. The pandemic rages on and the skies are clear over some city. You have left the trail. Please follow the signs. Laid bare structural inequalities, food, water, shelter, air. Maybe things can change on a dime. Climate is an idea. It is neither a thing to be tasted nor a quality of light to be described. It is an abstraction, like love or anger or peace. It is everywhere and nowhere at once. It is in a boardroom on the 30th floor, in the aisle seat of a flight from New York to Dubai, in the ocean tides below, in your morning coffee, behind the wheel of a car, tucked into the bark of a tree in the mountains where pinyon pines are infected by bark beetles. In his book, Weathered Cultures of Climate, Mike Hume makes a distinction between this abstract climate and a specific and embodied weather. He writes, I'm quoting Hume here, even though we live in climates, I cannot show you climate. Later, Hume continues, since there can be no unmediated access to climate, all representations of climate are in the end political acts. That is, they are engaged in constructing different and selective climatic realities, material, ideological, imaginative, normative. So here, Hume, excuse me, is writing specifically of the challenges of representing climate in art. In the context of poetry, the abstract idea of climate goes against the adage that image should come over abstraction, perhaps best articulated in the canonical line from William Carlos Williams' mid-20th century epic poem, Patterson, no ideas but in things. The accepted wisdom from this line, at least within much of American poetry in the second half of the 20th century and onwards, which is the tradition I was more or less trained in as a poet, was that concrete image should be the matter of poetry rather than abstract idea. This has been one of the difficulties in representing climate change across the arts. The representation of events and images comes to stand in for representation of a concept that is an abstraction over time, namely weather averaged. Climate change is a social and cultural issue, as those of you in this group are well aware. Or we might consider climate change as a social and cultural condition, to use Bulkley's framing, rather than as solely a physical Earth system's condition. By this, I mean that the social and cultural realms, these categories overlap, and I include economic and political within them, are the primary realms through which action to address climate change has haltingly and insufficiently progressed. This is increasingly and abundantly clear. When approaching climate change as a social and cultural issue, one encounters multiple narratives or framings of climate change. For example, following Hume and Manzo, here are just a few ways that climate change is understood or portrayed. As an apocalyptic threat to humanity, as a national security issue, as an engineering problem, as a social and environmental justice issue, which connects with shared and differentiated understandings of vulnerability, of course, as a hoax, as a business opportunity, as a crisis of capitalism, patriarchy, settler colonialism, racism, and/or neoliberalism, or as a or as an opportunity for radical transformation. Think about, if you're watching the news in the last couple of days, how the framings and narratives starting to come out of the COP29 that just started this week are built on versions of these competing narratives or frames of climate change. How climate change is framed then has reverberations for how it is approached or addressed or ignored. For instance, I think it's well known that the incoming president in the US, Donald Trump, has repeatedly called climate change a hoax and has signaled his intent to withdraw from the Paris Agreement once again. This framing of climate change as a, quote, hoax allows someone like Myron Ebel, a US conservative aligned with Trump's transition team in his first administration, to say, and I'm quoting Ebel here, the sooner you forget all this stuff about reducing emissions, the better. end quote, and to frame climate adaptation and mitigation as the climate industrial complex and climate alarmism. Alternately, here in the US, in the wake of the recent elections, I am already seeing a shift to more state level or local governance re engaging with climate leadership. The governor of New Mexico, where I live, leads a coalition of governors that is sending a delegation to COP29. Travis Kellerman, a senior climate policy advisor for my state of New Mexico, argues that our state is, and I'm quoting here, a differentiated powerhouse for environmental justice, collective sustainability, and a just transition. So you can hear in that quote that this is very much echoing the language, as I understand it, of climate vulnerability, adaptation, and mitigation. These two examples I just shared are mainly to illustrate that these framings of climate change also map onto deeper ideologies about human environment relationship, expressed through social, political, and economic systems. When I think about climate change from a geopoetics standpoint, climate change is about time and materiality. Time, the scales of time in which we must think to understand climate. Materiality, minerals, fossils, plastic bags, the decayed remains of marine life powering our machines. In short, organizations of matter. And one way to understand a poem is as a reorganization of matter. A poem is made by the fleeting materiality of language, things represented and evoked, shapes and sounds of words, rhythms and patterns repeated, rhythms and patterns fragmented, splintered. The world of a poem can be a place to play and experiment with different ideas of the subject. As I have described it, climate is an abstract idea, and climate change contains, excuse me, a multitude of contestable narratives or frames. One of the other arising narratives, to paraphrase Amitav Ghosh, is that climate change is paradoxically a collective condition arising at a time in history marked by a hegemonic Western insistence on the individual liberal humanist subject as the primary organizing body and principle of society. In response, a poem might be a sphere in which to critically creatively engage with concepts emanating from new materialist and post-humanities trends in the humanities and social sciences that work to decenter said subject. Here, I'd like to turn to and share another poem, and this one responding to a quote by Donna Haraway. So the quote, which again becomes the title of the poem, is lots of trouble, lots of kin to be going on with. And here is my poem responding to that Donna Haraway quote. Sitting outside reading Haraway next to a pond, next to a summer receding lake in the Oregon outback. Beyond the reeds, the landscape is horizontal water lines, earth alkaline color. I just read the chapter on pigeons while the swallows bank the sky right here, and ha, one drops bird shit directly onto the page I have open. It's the beginning of chapter 2. What happens when human exceptionalism and bounded individualism, those old saws of Western philosophy and political economics, become unthinkable in the best sciences, whether natural or social? I flick the shit off the page, which leaves a brownish smudge that I realize could be mistaken for a watercolor brushstroke, So I make a notation in the margin, bird shit, ha, while reading at Playa Pond in Oregon, 6 July 2017. We're in the middle of one big detritus convention, all of us, microbes and tentacles, out on the playa. T is watering seeds planted in the dry cracks of the ground. The earth is a composted poem, art, interspecies, material, practice. Since Dipesh Chakrabarty argued that anthropogenic climate change has broken open any distinction between natural history and human history, the four theses that he proposed in the Climate of History have been taken up or extended by a body of scholarly literature that might be considered critical Anthropocene studies. Chakrabarty outlined four theses that expressed how the term Anthropocene, which posited the anthro as a universal human collectivity or species history, was in tension with post-colonial understandings of difference. How do we relate to a universal history of life, to universal thought, that is, while retaining what is of obvious value in our post-colonial suspicion of the universal, he asked. I was quoting Chakraborty. The crisis of climate change, he continued, calls for thinking simultaneously on both registers to mix together the immiscible chronologies of capital and species history. This combination, however, stretches in quite fundamental ways the very idea of historical understanding. So I want to think for a few minutes with the representative and performative aspects of the concept of the Anthropocene, in which the human is curiously centered and decentered at once. The term's etymology itself, anthro, of course, centers the human as a geologic force. However, the curiousness is that it also implicitly decenters the human, as it places the human within the scale of geologic time. I'm reminded of my experience teaching environmental education to children at a residential environmental school. At the end of a week in the White Mountains of New Hampshire in the northeastern United States, where students would come and hike with us and learn about forest and wetland ecology, as well as about human impact, we would also teach a lesson in which we shrunk the geologic age of the Earth down into a year-long calendar to express relationally when humans came along. This, I believe, is a common trope in environmental education that likely originated from a short story called Forever the Land, the most amazing movie ever made, first published in a general interest magazine in 1951. The take home was that if January 1st was roughly 4.5 billion years ago, it would be late on December 31st before humans come along. In other words, in the scale of geologic time, human presence, as a measure of time rather than impact, is minuscule. And this decentering of the human is also embedded within the Anthropocene term. This centering, decentering tension is one of the key facets of the Anthropocene, and a tension that is, I would argue, particularly suitable to geopoetic engagement. This leads me to another poem from the project, this time in response to Mike Hume. And here is the quote from Hume, which again becomes the title of the poem that I then respond to the quote. So the title is, "In the Anthropocene, there can be no climate in the old sense, only weather cultures, with people acting as weather culturalists." And here's my poem in response. The compost pile teems with industrial wreckage, the great acceleration, tipping points, planetary boundaries. It was the best of the apocalypso. It was the worst of the apocalypse. Tempo, tiempo, weather, time. It was the best of the apocalypse. It was the worst of the apocalypso. People marched in the streets. People stood with water. People held cabinet meetings under the sea. An artist drew a line in a city where the ocean water will be. How does one reconcile the multiple trajectories of history, catastrophe, and transformation? Throw the old categories in with the millipedes and slugs. Tempo, tiempo, weather, time. Sift and turn, let the air in for better decomposition. Amitav Ghosh, in his book The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, writes that climate change events are, I'm quoting Ghosh here, peculiarly resistant to the customary frames that literature has applied to nature. They are too powerful, too grotesque, too dangerous, and too accusatory to be written about in a lyrical or elegiac or romantic vein. Indeed, in that these events are not entirely of nature, whatever that might be, they confound the very idea of nature writing or ecological writing. They are instances, rather, of the uncanny intimacy of our relationship with the non human. Ghosh is writing particularly of literary fiction and the form of the novel. He contends that, I'm quoting Ghosh again here, new hybrid forms will emerge and the act of reading itself will change once again. I've recently been reading Pramod Nair's Vulnerable Earth book, in which he also argues, and I'm quoting here, Pramod, that speculating on forms of multi species justice and the possibilities of restoring a measure of balance in the planetary ecosystem require that literature also experiment with genres and modes. So I propose in this project that I'm sharing today that a geopoetics practice, one that blends the forms of poetry and critical geography, is one of these new hybrid forms. A poem or a film or an art installation often does different work than a scholarly essay, and works in creative critical forms may help produce interdisciplinary and hybrid conversations and reach new audiences. So, climate change has explicitly been the subject of a number of poetry anthologies over the last decade, such as Heidi Lynn Staples and Amy King's 2017 book, Big Energy Poets Eco Poetry Thinks Climate Change, while other anthologies, such as Russo and Reed's Counter Desecration, a glossary for writing in the Anthropocene, which experiments with the poetics of the glossary entry form, have implicitly dealt with climate change. A series of 20 climate change poems curated by UK's then poet laureate Carol Ann Duffy ran in The Guardian in 2015. Books by individual poets likewise both implicitly and explicitly address climate change. For just a couple examples, Alison Cobb's After We All Died, Kathy Jetnil Kajiner's Ayub Jel Tak, Poems from a Marshallese Daughter, or Craig Santos Perez's Habitat Threshold. There are many more, of course, and new books and works are coming out as we speak. In Ghosh's book, The Great Derangement, one of his arguments is that contemporary literary fiction as a genre has not been able to engage with climate change because it has internalized and taken the individual liberal humanist subject as its primary focus. He writes, at exactly the time when it has become clear that global warming is in every sense a collective predicament, humanity finds itself in the thrall of a dominant culture in which the idea of the collective has been exiled from politics, economics, and literature alike. Note that recent works of fiction and literary criticism does indeed take this up. Again, for instance, I'm thinking about Pramad's Vulnerable Earth book here. I am going to turn back to poetry, though, and argue that poetry as a genre has many ways of experimenting with subjectivity. In the compression of the space of a poem, a subject is often fluid and resists the solidification of a liberal humanist individuality. Time in a poem also often resists a linear movement, in contrast to the linearity of modernity that understands time, to quote Gauche quoting Latour, as an irreversible arrow, as capitalization, as progress. So, in my field of human and cultural geography, a geopoetics practice that infuses a critical approach to the geo with a creative approach of poetics can help enliven both the geo and the poetic. In turn, opening up to alternative modes of conceptualizing and presenting form and content. In other words, alternative ways of making worlds. I have a 6-year-old child. There are fair odds that he will live to see the year 2100. Born in the summer of 2018, he will be in his early 80s at the turning of the century. I have no idea what the world will look like then. Whether looking back over the 21st century will be littered with catastrophes and extinctions, wars and famines, or whether it will be a time of turning and positive socio-ecological transformation. Likely, it will be both and all. I've largely given up on monolithic imaginations of some future ecotopia, just as I have given up on some future apocalyptic dystopia. While ecotopian, utopian, and dystopian narratives may be useful framing conceits, and perhaps sometimes useful for inciting action, they don't ultimately get at the ongoing multiple trajectories of history. So this climate geopoetics project isn't ultimately about hope or despair. Two of the ways that orientations toward climate change and environmental catastrophe and renewal are often framed. Rather, I'd like to think that it is about play and experimentation and addressing climate change at our current moment in time. And put mildly, it's an extraordinary time that we're living in and through. So I'd like to close with one last poem. And this poem responds to a quote by Indigenous poet and scholar Alison Adele Hedge Coke. And the quote from Alison Adele Hedge Coke is, "Someone's still calling, saving the earth is not a competition, but an essential collaboration." And here is my poem response to that quote from Hedge Coke. Trees talk with each other underground in mycorrhizal languages, and the human body is itself a collaboration, more non-human than human. Think, go with your gut and repeat after me. I am mostly microbial flora. I mean it. Say it out loud. I am mostly microbial flora. How does that feel? Though all the predator and prey eat and are eaten, how the world is organized is a function of belief. For instance, enough with the survival of the fittest trope. which really came out of assumptions of human nature based on some fantasy of Homo economicus. Let's get to the nature of human nature, which is microbial collaboration. But that's just science or Western science. And there are stories and prophecies that knew all along. Come waters, soil, mammals, fish, plants, birds and insects, winds and fire. Come, friends, let's walk into this new world together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Magrane, for that most amazing fusion between poetry and academics. So I hope you would now take questions and comments from the audience.
Yes, I'd be happy to take questions and comments. And I think hopefully I left a little time. Can you help me and facilitate the
Yes, yes,
questions to make sure I don't
absolutely.
miss them?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Roy has a question. Roy, please go ahead.
First of all, thank you, Professor Magrane. That was indeed enlightening. Mine was more of an observation than a question. I went through some of your poems, and it's with regard to the taxonomy of certain species that appear in the works, both flora and fauna. Namely, from Tumamok, spade-foot toads, from bycatch, shovel-nosed guitarfish, from Bear Wallow wilderness, Franciscan bluebells, and western wallflowers. So I noted how, at the very level we name the species, we name them based on their resemblance to anthropogenic tools and structures. Oh, this thing looks like a shovel. This frog looks like this toad looks like a spade. Its feet. So since we have some poetic license, I was trying to imagine a situation where, let's say we would name our tools based on the resemblance to these animals and plants, or a situation where we are more familiar with our fellow organisms than our implements. Again, that goes maybe I think that goes a bit towards ecotopia that you were trying to warn us away from. But still, considering the close to dystopic, ecological, let's say, sense that humans generally have, I was wondering if there would be such cause for optimism, or would that be pointless, rumination. That was my observation.
Oh yeah, thank you so much. So and there's a couple things there that maybe I can respond to. One, the the naming of species, or like more than human others, and the complicated nature of that. And I think your idea, if I understood it correctly, thinking about like trying to shift that a little bit, like what happens if we name certain human systems off of like different maybe different more than human languages, is an interesting experiment. There's this one project that I tried to do at the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum when I was poet in residence there, actually trying to co-create a poem with an otter, thinking about like what happens if like poetry and aesthetics, which is often situated within like a human frame, like was shifted. The idea that humans aren't the only species that have a sense of aesthetics, which of course, when you think of like say bowerbirds or different species like that, there's definitely arguments for that. In terms of like naming and categorizing, it becomes really, really interesting and really, complicated in terms of like how humans organize, and within humans, differentiated humans like organize a world. So the projects that you were drawing from there, for instance, the Sonoran Desert Literary Field Guide, or the Tumamok project, we did in the Sonoran Desert Literary Field Guide book, we kind of mirrored it on Western taxonomy. So we had sections in terms of like birds, mammals, reptiles and amphibians, plants, and followed that kind of ordering, but tried to play with it. And each species had a poem or a prose piece that someone wrote, addressed to it, or in the voice of it, however they wanted to deal with that complicated question of like, do you anthropomorphize or not, and what are the ethics of that, those kinds of questions with field guide entries. But that project has been kind of like remade and copied in a number of different bioregions. So there's literary field guides coming out in a number of different bioregions, and one of the one that recently came out in Cascadia, so like the Pacific Northwest along what is now like U.S. and Canada, tried to think about taxonomy in a different way, based on like more like indigenous understandings of taxonomy than Western understandings, and organize it in terms of kinship relationships, and even question where like the species is, or where is the organism, right? I mean, that's one of the like questions. Where is the organism? Like, where's the one organism end and another begin? Yeah. Okay. So hopefully that got a little bit at your question and comment. Thank you.
Yes, Professor Magrane, thank you.
Asajit Datta has a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm audible. Yes, I thank you so much for your presentation. So I just thinking along the lines of Claire Colebrook's Essence on Extinction, and I remember what she says, that any thought process regarding extinction has to go through a destruction of imagination, right? A new kind of imagination, which actually entails the destruction of imagination, or the way we think in our anthropocentric ways. So. What I really want to ask is, don't you think that even writing poetry, any kind of, making anything, going through the familiar route of this literature, trotting on this path, is basically anthropocentric at the same time? So I'm also thinking of coral reef artworks. So don't you think moving away from any artwork which actually restores the presence of the human is a more valid, probably within quotation marks, a more valid approach towards the sense of an ending? Because poetry is, one of the ancient, I think, modes of expression, where also you're indulging in some kind of naming, which reminds me of what Adam did in the Bible. Like, he had the power to name. So don't you think this again a kind of probably, let's say, a kind of restoration of our own anthropocentric bias regarding extinction, that, okay, yes, I'm writing, I am restoring the balance, I am doing some kind of patchwork. So I am somewhere personally falling between it's too late, or okay, we still have time. But there is some kind of patchwork happening here. But how do you also see the role of literature, or personally the role of art in, I don't know, addressing this extinction matters? It's confusing to me at the same time. So I just want to know your
Thank
you.
Thank you. That's a big question, a big comment. So yes, like poetry, art, there are limitations, obviously, to them, and coming off of these traditions, and like there's a certain power, a certain power move that happens with naming something, and of course it's, or at least as humans are writing or making artwork, it is somewhat, it almost always like some form of anthropocentric. I think that in terms of thinking about like the work that, there's a couple ways to answer this. The work that poetry and literature and art may do in relationship to like vulnerability, or the climate crisis, right? Which I was speaking about. Like one way that's often talked about is that might reach publics in a way differently than saying, showing charts and graphs about like the great acceleration would, for instance, right? And there's that argument to be made, and that's consistently made, that like, I've been in a lot of conversations between artists and scientists, and like writers and scientists. And sometimes I play like artist or poet, sometimes I play scientist or social scientists. And often it becomes where, oh, the artists and the writers are there to help communicate the science to the public, right? Which may or may not like work, right? And there's all of these problematics like embedded, within that. I think your example of like work with the coral reef, like more and more I think about like artwork and poetics in relationship to like say permaculture practices, in relationship to collaboration, and thinking about like being really drawn to artists and writers who are using their practice as like environmental remediation, or actually projects that do something within a particular community, within a particular place, whether that's gathering and building human to human relationships to build solidarities for certain actions or certain kind of like ways of relating with a community. And by community there, I mean like human and more than human and everything that everyone and thing that's in a community, or whether they're actually practices that do some sort of ecological work. So like lately I've been working on getting into rainwater harvesting and water harvesting as a geopoetic practice, right? Where I've been thinking about poetry. So this is another way to think through geopoetics that I didn't speak about today, where what we normally think of as like a poem, right, which is like words spoken or words on a page, or this idea of naming, is not the poetics. Like geopoetics as etymologically earth making, right, where ecopoetics has been spoken about as house making. So what happens if we think about house making and earth making, like literally as a practice, right? So can like digging basins to harvest rainwater off of like my roof in a small watershed, you know, in like 1,000 square foot area, is that a geopoetic practice? And is there a certain kind of like relationship with matter that can be reproduced there in a way that all of this talking can't, that then can go out in a community and like continue to build like rainwater harvesting? That's on my mind right now. As a geopoetic practice, like taking like going through poetry to like lose language or leave language to get towards some other way of action. So yeah, I riffed on your comments, which I agree
Yeah.
with.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Dr. Magrane, if you wouldn't mind, I had a question. The poems that you read during your talk were all responses to several others. So from people like Atwood to Donna Haraway. How would you look, as in, first of all, was this a conscious choice, these choice of poems? And also, how would you look at the idea of responding itself as a larger, in a larger sense, as in, as your uh, aesthetic as well as academic response to the climate crisis? So would you help us think a bit more about the idea of responding itself?
Right. Great question. So I think about this project as a way for me to think through environmental narratives in a way where within a poem, rightly or wrongly, I feel like I can do different things than when I'm writing like a more scholarly, so to speak, piece, where within a poem, the sort of like movement or juxtapositions, like I don't feel the need to explain as much within the poem. I can put something next to something else in a way that traditionally, in like a scholarly or explanatory mode, you kind of need to like show those thoughts, those steps of thought, like this leads to this, or this builds on this kind of thought. So really, the project started shortly after I had completed my PhD. I went and did this art science residency with a mixture of artists and scientists who are working in some way on climate change, and being able to do it in poetic form for me opened up this this kind of like freeing, right? And I think of the poems as a way to, you know, most of the poems and a number of them that I share today, at least the first one that I share today, I think of them as kind of like these talky kind of like run-on sentence kind of poems, and they like allow me to engage with those environmental narratives or those climate narratives, but engage with them in for me anyway, something that can be more fun and do something different in my mind as I'm working on it than if I'm going through and making a larger logical argument about what particular climate narratives do.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Mhm.
Are there any more questions, comments, and responses to Professor Magrane's lecture? If there are no more questions, I would like to extend a formal vote of thanks to Professor Eric Magrane, first of all, for that most amazing lecture, where it's not very often that we have had poet academics giving talks. So the manner in which you alternated between your lecture as well as your poetry, that was rare and that was amazing. So thank you for your talk, and also for accepting our invitation as part of the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies. So a big thank you to everybody in the audience for coming and for responding with the speaker, for asking questions, for your comments, and so on. So thank you so much, and we hope to see you all for the next lecture. And all these talks will subsequently be available in our YouTube channel, so you can watch them there, share, and so on. So thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Magrane. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so
Okay.
much. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for all of the work that you're doing.